But now the question arises. We know the expectation of these people. They lived in the first century. They were under tribulation. They had been told by John that they are to expect something soon. But what is it they are to expect? And this leads me to my third major point, the theme of Revelation. Let's consider for a few moments the thematic statement. That is, John states his theme up front, and the whole rest of the book of Revelation is an explication of that theme. And I'm going to be reading Revelation 1:7 from Young's literal translation of the Bible. And if you find some of these real literal, woodenly literal translations of the Bible, you will find it interpreted this way, and then I'm going to make some comments on it. Behold, he is coming with clouds, and every eye see him, and they also who pierced him. And all tribes of the land will mourn because of him. You notice it read kind of awkwardly. Young's literal translation is pressing home the literal translation here. Behold, he comes with clouds, every eye see him, and they also who pierced him, and all the tribes of the land will mourn because of him. Now remember, just 4 verses prior to this, this is Revelation 1:7. 4 verses prior, he says these things are near. And just 6 verses prior, he says that these things are shortly to come to pass. And then he gives this theme statement. Well, what does he mean by this theme statement? This theme statement sounds like the Second Advent. And there is a relationship between AD 70 and the destruction there and the final glorious coming of Christ. Just like there are similarities between the language here and the destruction of Babylon in Isaiah 13, Idumea in Isaiah 34, and then other places in the Old Testament. These are activities of God in the realm of men. So we can expect some similarities of language there. But what does he say here? How do I know that this refers to AD 70? Why would I suppose that, since it sounds so much like the glorious, final, conclusive act of history, the second coming of Christ? Well, let me give you some evidence, 3 lines of evidence, that what he is saying here is he's coming in judgment upon the temple. First, and some of this you've heard before last night, particularly in my message on Matthew 24, he speaks of his coming with clouds. This is apocalyptic language. This is language that we spoke about a few moments ago, and Dr. Ferguson gave a very good reminder that this language is drawn from Daniel chapter 7:13, which is a heavenly vision of Christ being given the keys of the kingdom, as it were, of being given the right to rule. This cloud coming is apocalyptic language. It is common language among the poetically inspired prophets of the Old Testament, which speak of divine visitation upon historical nations who set themselves against God. When a nation falls, God is judging. God has come into the realm and the experience of that nation. This is not a mere evidence of history as sound and fury signifying nothing. This is not simply history being read with tooth and claw. This is interpretive history. When Babylon fell, the secular historians might tell us, well, this is the way things go among nations. The Bible prophet tells us, no, it's not just the way things go. God, Jehovah God, is coming to judge. And again, I'd like to mention that one reference that I used yesterday, since we don't have a whole lot of time. Isaiah 19:1. When the Assyrians overthrow Egypt, the prophecy of that event says, the burden against Egypt, behold, the Lord rides a swift cloud and will come into Egypt. And again, no sane commentator says that God hopped on a cloud and taxied down into Egypt and became visible and began laying waste to the land. The commentators tell us this is an apocalyptic reference to the destruction of Egypt in a particular war. Therefore, if apocalyptic language will allow us to understand a divine judgment in history as a cloud coming, then the possibility is open to us here in Revelation 1:7. And this becomes all the more significant, not only because he says these events are near at hand and shortly to come to pass, which really is enough, But also, if you consider Matthew 21, verses 40 and following, which, by the way, is interpreted even by premillennial scholars as a reference to AD 70. Matthew 21, verse 40, and then verse 43, for time's sake, Christ gives the parable of the vine owner. He says, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine dressers that have abused his prophets and now his son? They said to him, he will destroy those wicked men miserably. When the vine owner comes, what's he going to do? Destroy the wicked men. Well, verse 43 has Christ saying, therefore, I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to a nation bearing the fruits of it. And in verse 45, we read, now when the chief priests heard, they perceived he was speaking of them. They had a little insight now. My point is, Matthew 21 uses coming language of the destruction of Jerusalem. The scribes and Pharisees knew exactly what he was talking about. They perceived it, and I believe that's what John is talking about even here. But secondly, under this proof, this evidence for Revelation 1:7 being a reference to AD 70, notice verse 7 says, in effect, he's coming against those who pierced him. Who are those who pierced him? It is especially the first century Jews. They are the ones who cried out, crucify him, we have no king but Caesar. If you let him go, you are no friend of Caesar's. Forcing Pilate, even he washed his hands in their presence and said, I'm innocent of this man's blood. And they said, his blood be upon us and our children. The Jews of the first century demanded the crucifixion of Christ. In Matthew 27:25 is where he says, his blood be upon us and our children, crucify him. And his blood comes down upon them and their children in that generation. All the way through the New Testament record, we see the primary covenantal focus of the crucifixion of Christ falling upon the Jews. In Acts 5:30, Peter is preaching. He says, the God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom you murdered by hanging on a tree. He's blaming his Jewish family for crucifying Christ. He does the same thing in Acts 2:36, 3 verses 13 through 15, chapter 7 verse 52, and Paul does it in 1 Thessalonians 2 verses 14 through 16, and on we could go with references. And so the responsibility for the death of Jesus Christ, according to the biblical record, even though physically the Romans actually pierced him, the covenantal responsibility falls upon the Jews. They demanded it, and Rome was forced, as it were, to do it. And then thirdly, as a line of evidence for AD 70 being the reference for verse 7, notice that he says, all the tribes of the land will mourn. Now the word earth, translated earth there, is the Greek word gay, which can mean either earth or land. And as a matter of fact, the land is a famous designation for Israel's land, the promised land. The idea of the land is something very dear to the Jew, as all of us, I'm sure, are well aware. And then he says, all the tribes of the land. And when you think of Israel, you think of its division into the 12 tribes. So, what John is saying here is, Jesus, whom you crucified, is coming to judge you, and all of your tribes, all the tribes of the land, will mourn because of this. It will be a public event. His destruction of the temple, not his appearing physically as a public event, but his judgment will be a public event of great and grievous proportions.